So I thought I'd mention to you that this just came through my feed the other day. I think it was probably like 3 days ago, actually. So it's just a popular source article, but it's about the trolley problem and ChatGPT answering moral questions and the presuppositions that the model has in it. So it's a pretty quick read. Since we just covered it and AI's all over the place, I thought I might as well mention it in case somebody's interested in seeing it. So again, the trolley problem was introduced to, it can be used different ways. One of the ways it used it in that article was to kind of get you to think about some basic intuitions you might have. And the two theories that we're going to be covering, this last week and this week, deontology and utilitarianism, are usually contrasted with each other. They're the two big schools of modern moral philosophy, at least in Western thought. So what we want to do today is go over a little exercise on the universalizability test that was introduced in the remote lecture. So again, this is moral reasoning according to deontology, a slightly simplified version of this. Deontology just means the study of duties. All the moral theories that we're looking at right now have duties, but they don't all justify them the same way, right? So utilitarianism is going to say we're obligated to perform actions that would have the foreseeable consequences of maximizing overall happiness. But that's a teleological theory. Deontology is not a teleological theory or a consequentialist theory and claims that some actions are inherently wrong. And so that's what the simplified universalizability test is aiming at trying to identify for us. This is, again, moral reasoning according to deontology. So it's basically the way I reduced it is to try to, we're kind of going to skip over a problem that arises in the literature with Kant, how to precisely distinguish perfect from imperfect duties, at least in some cases, and just kind of think about another problem called the generality of maxims, the problem of the generality of maxims. And the reason why we're going to focus on that is because it's directly related to the universalizability test that you learned about last time. So here are the basic steps in this, again, simplified Kantian moral reasoning. Kant thinks that all of our actions enshrine some maxim, some principle of action. So if you see me do what I'm about to do here, take a drink of water, what maxim do you think is enshrined in that act? When I am thirsty, I will take a drink of water, right? So I will take a drink of water in order to quench my thirst, right? You could do it different ways, but notice it's got to have a few key things in there. It's got to have the action that you're performing and the end towards which you are, what goal you're trying to achieve. That's about as all teleologically is going to get, but the rightness or wrongness isn't derived on the outcome of the action like it will be in the next theory. It's going to be based on whether that trying to universalize that maxim generates any contradictions. So moral impermissibility is based on logical contradiction. Again, it's actually two different types of contradictions we'll have to worry about. So the first part of our exercise that we'll do here in a minute after I go over a couple of things is just to rehearse Kant's own version of this test with one of his own examples. Go back to the example that I'm going to use here. We're going to do not neglecting talents on making lying promises. Promises you don't intend to keep will be our example here. And then we're going to apply that. So we'll do that as a rehearsal. Then I'm going to take the back side of the worksheet as a grade. So the point scoring will be a little bit different than what's written on there. So we're going to do one version as a practice, and then I'm going to see how well y'all apply it to another hypothetical. But in the process, before we do that, I want to mention this problem of the generality of maxims. And so this is one of the main problems that they introduced, Trammell and Bergeron introduced in the reading for today. Let me make that a little bit bigger. Here, up here. So the problem arises in two ways. If we make our maxims so general, then it looks like nothing's going to be impermissible. And if we make them super specific, everything's going to be permissible. So that's why they talk about the problem of generality of maxims. So they use this one test case in here of two professors trying to decide whether or not they can hold class in a particular spot. So the reason why I assigned this article, a couple of reasons. It's a little bit longer, but it does a good job of giving you a contemporary example of revising an influential moral standard, namely Kant's categorical imperative, and trying to parse out what really has to be involved in it. And so different ways of presenting the categorical imperative by Kant, and there's a debate among Kantians and other philosophers about how to understand the relationship between these different formulations, whether they're kind of all elaborating on the same point, or if maybe there's a gap in there, even though Kant wants to claim that they are all a part of one theory. And so several different versions of it were covered in the reading and in that article. So the first one, where we get the universalizability test, is from the first formula: act only according to the maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Act in such a way as that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, never merely as a means to an end, but always as an end in itself, so as intrinsically valuable, not having just use value. The third practical principle follows from the first two as the ultimate condition of harmony with practical reason, that the will of every rational being is a universally legislating will. So notice the first two, especially the first one, seems monological, but then that third one, it's like a group of rational agents together. And then the last one, act according to maxims of a universally legislating member of a merely possible kingdom of ends, since we don't have an actual one. Again, hypothetical there. And so again, we get the universalizability test out of this first version of the categorical imperative. So how are we to understand that? What does that really mean? Big point that they make in the article is about fairness and unfairness. It's a pretty commonplace idea to think of double standards as unfair, right? And so think about contradiction again and a double standard. That's affirming a double standard, right? So the essence of fairness, they write, the essence of unfairness is a double standard. They who act unfairly hold themselves to a different standard than they apply to others. They make an exception of themselves. The essence of fairness is a single standard. They who act fairly hold themselves to the same standard they apply to others. They do not make an exception of themselves. Their standard is universalizable. Everyone is capable of choosing standards, could choose to follow it, right? Because it doesn't involve any kind of contradiction. We're going to have to worry about two different types of contradiction. So, a couple different ways of thinking about what that first formulation means. Act only on the maxim whereby you can at the same time rationally will that it become a universal law. And so one of the things that's important here is Kant makes a distinction between our inclinations, which are basically our animal nature and our instincts, versus our rational will. And so they're putting that in parentheses there to emphasize the idea that it's not about just wanting something or desiring something, because desires are contingent and change between people. It has to be a matter of what's rationally willable in order to be universalizable. And so they worry about two formulations there of maxims. In order to get served faster, I'll cut in line. In order to get a loan, I shall make a lying promise. That's Kant's own example there again. And then how should we use that? How should we formulate that? So if we take the FLU, the formula of the universal law, to mean act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time rationally will, not just want or desire, that it become a universal law. So first, identify the maxim and formulate it. Again, the maxim is just a subjective principle of action, and we're going to see whether it can be universalized coherently or not. And if it can't, then it's morally wrong to act on that maxim. In the next theory, we'll see that if the consequences of the action bring about more harm than good, then it's morally wrong. Here, it's based on a contradiction of some kind, right? So, two different examples. Identify the maxim. Recast the maxim as a universal law. That's the second step. So it moves from just me to everyone will cut in line to get served. Everyone will cut in line when they want to get served faster. Whenever anyone needs to get a loan, they'll make a lying promise to get the loan, right? So it's just moving from I'm doing this, one individual's doing this, to then everybody's doing it. right? That's the first two steps. And then the third one is, does the universalized version of the maxim generate any contradictions? And we got to, again, worry about two different kinds of contradictions here. The first one, what we're calling the formal contradiction, is basically the sense of contradiction that I introduced way back at the beginning of the semester. P and not P are affirmed at the same time, right? The other one is a contradiction of will, and it's slightly different. Some maxims can't be conceived as a universal without contradiction, right? So that would be failing that first formal step. Some other ones will pass that step, but you still wouldn't will it to be a universal law, because you wouldn't want to live under that law itself. It would cause some kind of contradiction to arise in your own projects. So that's called a contradiction of will, and it's usually what indicates an imperfect duty. All right, so now let's take a look at the generality of maxims. So most of us, when we're little kids, your parents give you like very general maxims, right? Don't lie, keep promises, tell the truth, right? But then it's really easy to generate a hypothetical where you would want to break that, like for some bad consequence, something like that, right? Always keep your promises or always tell the truth, but I'm going to lie to the Nazis at the door. So then that either means something's wrong with that maxim, right? Or something wrong with my application of it. Look, most of those rules are too simplistic to be good moral rules. That's what's going to really, for this lesson and the utilitarian lessons, we're going to have to worry about those kind of simplistic moral rules to see if they're any good or not. So as a way of getting at that, in this article, they use this formulation: act as if the maxim of your action were to become, through your will, a universal law of nature. And then as they go through the different interpretations, they arrive at, what they think the best understanding of that formula is, right? So we got two doctors, and they're going to appeal both to universalizability. Two professors here. Dr. Z's maxim is, in order to promote a happy learning environment in my class, I shall regularly hold it at the campus coffee shop. That looks like it's a non-universalizable one. Everybody couldn't do that. There wouldn't be enough room. And then Dr. T's maxim, in order to accomplish a happy learning environment in my class with 4 students, I shall regularly hold it at the campus coffee shop. I had a class last semester, it had 7 students in it. That would be easy for me to always do at the coffee shop. But a class this size, could we go meet at the coffee shop and everybody all go meet at the coffee shop? No, not enough room, right? So there's got to be some kind of problem in there. But notice, both of them appeal to universalizability, and they give different results depending on how we describe our maxims. Right? So this theory is really going to depend on us having a clear understanding of what we're up to. And Kant acknowledges one problem with his theory is that sometimes we don't even know what our maxims are ourselves, right? So that's a problem called the self-transparency of maxims. But this is just another problem just about them being too general or too specific and implying morally counterintuitive conclusions, as we've seen as one of the objections for a moral theory, right? So we've seen that a few times now. So again, ethical egoism, the moral reasoning is to figure out whether it's in your enlightened rational self-interest to do X. In social contract theory, would all self-interested individuals agree to do X, right? And here, it's this universalizability test. So a lot of what these philosophers are disagreeing about isn't so much the content of morality, although they do have some differences there. It's how to justify those claims. That's what they're disagreeing about, whether they're an egoist, social contract theorist trying to work out the prisoner dilemma, or Kantians with their universalizability test. And they're also have an ends test that we'll look at as well. And then utilitarians are going to try and calculate utility, right? So again, different forms of moral reasoning. So we got these two doctors. They appeal to universalizability, but what moral conclusions we get is going to depend on how we describe what we're up to. And we can describe things in various specific ways or more or less general ways and end up with different results. Well, that starts to make it look like, you could just play a word game and make anything morally bad or morally right. So they say, that points then to a problem with that formulation of the categorical imperative. So they move to FLU 1. Act only according to the maxims whereby you can at the same time rationally will that it, with the circumstances conceived as generally as possible, should become a universal law. So don't lie is pretty general. Keep your promises, again, quite general. There's no, if we take that at face value, there's no exceptions built into that, right? It's just a blanket statement that all lying is bad. So if we do this, it looks like too few things would be wrong if we allow every kind of circumstantial detail into maxims. If my maxim is kill bald dudes that wear black t-shirts on Tuesdays, I'm going to be able to universalize that, right? There's no blatant formal contradiction in that. But that obviously is going to look like something that is not that great of a moral conclusion, right? So too few things would be wrong if we allowed every kind of circumstantial detail in it. And too many things would be wrong if we allowed no kind of circumstantial evidence in it. So this raises the question of what exactly gets to go in and gets to be excluded from my maxim, right? That's the problem we're worried about. Everybody understand what the issue is there? So that's why they're calling it problem of generality of maxims, right? So let's work through that. Here's the maxim. In order to foster a happy learning environment, I will always hold class in the campus coffee shop. So that's a pretty general maxim. The second one was about the number of students in the class, right? So, and then here's another version of a maxim. In order to work comfortably, I will sit in my study chair now. Well, not everybody could sit in my study chair, so that can't be universalizable, right? So if we cannot include anything particular in those circumstances to the universal law, we'll similarly condemn eating any particular bit of food or breathing any particular part of air because somebody else couldn't breathe the same air as you, right? So we run into problems there. It's not universalizable. Yet it's not plausible that any of these things are morally wrong for you to take a breath, right? So that can't be morally wrong. You have to do that in order to live, right? You still have to respect yourself as an atonement agent as well here. So I say yet it's not plausible that any of these things are always wrong. Maybe if you had the last bit of air and you were like in a submarine, like filling up or something. But here they're just talking normal circumstances. So yeah, it's not plausible that any of these things are morally wrong, nor is it plausible to suppose that Kant meant for the categorical imperative to condemn those sorts of things. So let's go the other way. Try to be as specific as possible. In order to get served faster, a bald man wearing a black t-shirt will cut in line. Well, that just means that only bald guys in black t-shirts are cutting in line and everybody else. You see the double standard, right? So that's conceivable. In order to get served faster, every bald man wearing a black t-shirt cuts in line. Forming a queue to get served, right, still works as a way of getting served if only bald men wearing black t-shirts cut in the line, right? The specifics make it universalizable, so the maxim passes, but most of us want to say that's wrong, right? Notice that the fact that it's a bald guy in a black t-shirt doesn't seem to be really relevant to the morality of the question. Yeah.
Is this a contradiction of will?
Well, here not yet, because they're going to show that both too specific and too general both give us problems. But I'll come back to that difference. In many cases, it's pretty clear. In other cases, it's not so clear. But I'll come back to that. Right. The charity example is the best one there, so I'll come back to that here. Right. So the fact that the person is wearing that is bald and wearing a black t-shirt doesn't seem to be relevant at all to the morality of the question, right? So, but it would mean that all the bald guys in black t-shirts get to cut in line, and we probably think that's wrong, right? So the specificity of that counterexample, right? Here's another one. Again, showing that you could come up with a maxim that would pass the test, but that we would say this is a morally wrong conclusion. Right? So suppose I hate people of a certain race, religion, or ethnic group. Suppose it's Americans that I hate, and I'm not an American. So my maxim is, let me kill anyone who's an American. That means always kill Americans. So the universalized maxim doesn't generate a clear contradiction. So it's at least permissible. However, it seems morally wrong to kill Americans simply for being American, right? So again, it's taking very specific information and showing that arrive at a conclusion that we would object to, right? So on that interpretation of the universal law, it seems to show that it would justify genocide, right, in these sorts of things. But clearly, that's a problem, right? Part of it's because it's dividing up humanity into subcategories rather than treating them as all rational beings. And keep in mind that when Kant says humanity or moral person, he doesn't mean members of the Homo sapien species. He means rational agents. So if angels come down here and demonstrate rationality, I have obligations to them and they got obligations to me. If Brian Griffin, you know, a Family Guy, so he's not like, in a cartoon, he's the most rational one in the family, right? So I would have obligations to him as an animal because he's a rational being, even though he's not a human. But he's a moral person, meaning he has moral standard, right? So that's a kind of a key thing here. Again, a point of difference between deontology and utilitarianism. The utilitarians are going to say, any being that can experience pleasure or pain, we have to worry about. But for Kant, it's just rational beings that I have to worry about, right? So we can get an argument against that view of the CI, that it's not plausible. It would show that too few things would be wrong if we allowed every kind of circumstantial detail into our maxims. Too many things would be wrong if we allowed no kind of circumstantial detail into those maxims. So it looks like either way we go, the categorical imperative is going to imply counterintuitive moral conclusions. And again, remember, that was one of the things we pointed out way back at the beginning of the semester that often counts as a negative against the plausibility of the theory. So here's the other version, response 2 that they go through. Again, I'm just pulling these right out of that article by Bergeron and Trammell. So include only the morally relevant circumstances, giving us this formulation. So they're revising again. That interpretation of the universal law doesn't seem to work so well, but can we fix it? So in this one, we're going to include only the morally relevant circumstances. So act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time rationally will that it, conceived in terms of all and only the morally relevant circumstances, should become a universal moral law. So the color of my t-shirt or the fact that I am bald doesn't seem morally relevant to the question of cutting in line. Everybody with me so far? Right? Makes some sense? Again, trying to figure out what does and doesn't go in or belong in our maxim. If we go the other way, it looks like the law turns out to be useless and implausible. It's a pretty strong claim, right? So it is not they write, it is often not obvious what is morally relevant, especially in those cases where we most want help from the ethical, most want help, should be most, it says must, it should be most, want help from the ethical theory. For instance, FLU2 cannot settle the debate between doctors T and Z, who think that it's morally relevant that they have only 4 students in their class, so that makes it permissible for them to go to the thing. Again, putting in some detail, right? So if that doesn't help us resolve the debate, that's not counting in favor of Kant's theory here. They end up begging the question against one another. So they point out here that the deep problem is that we apparently need another moral theory, one that can tell us which circumstances are morally relevant in order to use FUL2 to determine what's right. So the theory on its own is not adequate. We need an additional theory of moral relevance, right? So again, it's a deficiency in Kant's argument there. So then they move to their final version of this. So this is their third iteration of that first universal law formula, is to surface between surface and underlying intentions, right? So think of your maxims as your intentions, all right? So here's the version that we're going to try and be working with here in our little exercise. So act only according to the maxim whereby you can at the same time rationally will that it, conceived of in terms of your most underlying intentions, including all and only causally relevant circumstances, should become a universal law. So if you're worried about whether it's permissible to kill this or that, the day of the week, it's probably not going to be relevant to that. But the end you're acting for to save many other rational beings or something like that from being used as mere means would be relevant, right?
That's the underlying most intention.
Yeah. So what what is, they're trying to get at, they're trying to undercut the generality and the specificity problems. They're giving us a more workable and applicable version of the categorical imperative, right? So my deepest intentions in the chain of my most underlying intentions is the intention that belongs in my maxim. The causally relevant circumstances requirement involves including those features of the circumstances that are relevant to the reason for acting, right? So baldness, black t-shirts aren't relevant to why I'm acting in line. Getting served faster is, right? Make some sense? Right. Very simple, everyday, kind of moral question there. Well, why are you cutting down the shoulder and cutting back in, right? Is it just to get through faster, or are you in an emergency, right? To save someone's life that you got to get to, right? So here's a little more on that causally relevant circumstance requirement. So nevertheless, we can sometimes begin to penetrate the depths of our motives. They've just mentioned that Kant points out these are not always clear to us. Sometimes you're conflicted about what your motive is. So then you wouldn't even be able to get off the ground with the universalizability test, right? So this brings us to the causally relevant circumstance requirement. If having a different social security number or hair color have nothing to do with my decision to rob a bank, then they don't belong in the maxim. If they, why I'm robbing the bank, like to get the money, would be, right? Just so I can be rich, or it might be in Robin Hood. So if they do belong in my maxim, then they cannot save my maxim from condemnation by the FLU, the first formula of the universal law. On the other hand, when Dr. T had more than 4 students, he did not hold his classes in the coffee shop. So his having only 4 students does belong in his maxim. So on that interpretation, underlying versus surface intentions is going to matter there. You could will that everyone who only has 4 students in class could meet there, right? But not that every class could meet there. Class size, same thing with, sitting in my chair. Everybody couldn't sit in the same chair, right? So again, with that third formula, distinguishing surface versus underlying intentions, and going with the underlying intentions, they think solves the problem of generality of maxims. When Dr. T had more than those 4 students, he didn't hold that class again. So that was morally relevant to a morally relevant fact to his moral reasoning in that scenario. So it helps us solve that problem and gives us an idea about what's morally relevant. So we don't need that second theory like we would if we just went with the second interpretation of the universal law. So we could do this with Rick Sanchez, whether it's, his maxim is to sell antimatter guns to an unethical assassin for chips and blitz tokens, entertainment money, right? So those would all be relevant in his maxim and would have to go in it. So back to your question, because this will also feed into our little worksheet here. Go back to, this is the first set of notes. Let's go over, let's see. I want to do formal contradiction and then a contradiction of the will to illustrate. And this is the one that we're going to use in our little exercise here. So this is Kant's example, again, him applying his universalizability test. Another man finds himself forced by need to borrow money. He well knows that he will not be able to repay it, but he also sees that nothing will be loaned to him if he does not firmly promise to repay it at a certain time. He desires to make such a promise, but he has enough conscience to ask himself whether it is not improper and opposed to duty to relieve his stress in such a way. Now his maxim would be, assuming he does decide to do so, the maxim of his action would be as follows. When I believe myself to be in need of money, I will borrow money and promise to repay it, although I know I shall never do so. Now this principle of self-love or of his own benefit may be compatible with his own future welfare. So again, here's Kant claiming that right and wrong aren't determined by consequences of the action. Okay, make this bigger so y'all can see it. Right? He immediately sees, and then so he goes to the second step. He's asking whether it's right or not and distinguishing what the correction of moral rightness from consequences of the action. Next theory, it's all going to be about the consequences. But for Kant, again, he's claiming that there are intrinsic features of the action that make it immoral, like a contradiction. So he says he immediately sees that it could never hold as a universal law of nature and be consistent with itself. Rather, it must necessarily contradict itself. For the universality of a law, which says that anyone who believes himself to be in need could promise what he pleased with the intention of not fulfilling it, would make the promise itself and the end to be accomplished by it impossible. So take that first part, the promise itself. When you issue a promise, what are you doing?
You're making an agreement.
Yeah, you're making an agreement that you're going to do something or not do something, right? So the notion of a promise that you don't intend to keep is not really a what? A promise. There's a formal contradiction in there. Everybody see that? So, and then he adds another layer to that. So there's our formal contradiction, right? That's our formal contradiction. Now he adds a layer to this. He also says, and the end to be accomplished by it would be impossible. No one would believe what was promised to him, but would only laugh at such an assertion in vain pretense. If everybody lied to get a loan, promising to repay the loan would cease to be a way of getting a what? A loan, because no one's going to trust anybody. So we got the formal contradiction, then we got the undermining of our goal when universalized there as well. So again, formal contradiction is driving that. That also drives the suicide example that he gives. And then let's do helping others, right? So we've got promise keeping and then helping others. Both of those are other regarding concerns, right? The suicide one is a self-regarding concern. So again, it's got perfect, imperfect duties, duties to others, and duties to yourself. Duties to self. So helping others, charity. What am I required to do to help others? A fourth man, for whom things are going well, sees that others whom he could help have to struggle with great hardships. And he asks, what concern of it is mine? Let each one be as happy as heaven wills, or that he can make himself. I will not take anything from him or even envy him. But to his welfare or to his assistance in time of need, I have no desire to contribute. If such a way of thinking were a universal law of nature, certainly the human race could exist. So it passes the conceivability test. Whereas making a promise you don't intend to keep has a formal contradiction, so technically it's not even conceivable as a universal law without contradiction. This one is conceivable as a universal law, but he's saying you wouldn't endorse it, right? So why wouldn't we endorse it? So if such a way of thinking were a universal law of nature, certainly the human race could exist, and without doubt, even better than in a state where everyone talks of sympathy and goodwill, or even exerts himself occasionally to practice them. While on the other hand, he cheats when he can and destroys or otherwise violates the rights of man. Now, although it is possible that a universal law of nature according to the maxim could exist, it's nevertheless impossible to will that such a principle should hold as a law of nature. In other words, it can be conceived as a universal law, but you wouldn't rationally will that it be that law and that you be governed by it. If you don't help anybody when they are in need, what does that imply about you when you're in need? You won't be helped. So, contradiction of will. You would want people to help you, but you couldn't have a life plan where that was a universal law without robbing yourself of assistance for right? So there's the contradiction in will. Perfect, imperfect duties come out of that. So just to summarize that real quick, Kant's examples of perfect duties, a duty to self is a prohibition on suicide, where it's the maxim involves self-love, right? So to spare myself future torment, I will hasten my death, but the motive for living is that you love yourself. We saw the promise-breaking example. There's a perfect duty to others. And imperfect duties, cultivating your talents and helping others. So how should we understand those? Here's a little more on that. So some maxims generate formal contradictions, so they can't be rationally conceived as universal laws. Again, Kant's examples, false promises and suicide. And the way we should understand a perfect duty is that it's always wrong or impermissible to X, whatever that duty is, false promises and suicides, right? To act on maxims that generate formal contradictions. So you get they're like absolute duties. There's another way of saying that. They're absolute duties. Imperfect duties, you get discretion about, you have to fulfill them, but you get discretion about how you go about doing that. Could you equally cultivate every one of your talents? Probably not. You're going to have to pick some time in order to actually cultivate ones, not enough hours in the day. So it would be wrong for you to, as his example is, to always pick self-indulgence over cultivating your talents. Because if you were always engaging in, if that was a universal law, you would probably have no means to indulge all of your indulgences, because it requires other people to have cultivated their talents, right? If I want to spend all my time playing a solo video game, right, and that's just my own example of that, that required that some other people forego a self-indulgence to get good at math and computer programming in order to build that thing. Everybody see, right? So it's always wrong or impermissible to X is how to understand perfect duties. And then it's wrong or impermissible for me to always Y. So it would be wrong or impermissible for me to always pick self-indulgence over cultivating my talents. Or it would always be wrong for me to refrain from acting charitably, right? I have to do it sometimes, but it's up to me how I do that. So contributing to other people's happiness is an imperfect duty according to Kant. So perfect, imperfect duties. Let's go back to our version of the test there, and then let's get some practice rehearsing this. I'm moving a little slow today. I tweaked my back. Brian, can you help me? Hopefully it's familiar to you. It was right out of the reading assignment for today. So let's consider another example. Cutting in line in order to get served faster is wrong according to the universal law formula of universal law, because you cannot cut in a line that at the same time will that everyone cuts in line. If everyone's cutting in line, there is no what? Line, and it ceases to be a way to get served at all. Formal contradiction, right? So in order to get served faster, I will cut in line. Universalized, taken as a universal law, this is self-contradictory. While Kant's way of talking about this seems awkward to many at first, the idea is familiar and intuitive. It's a double standard, right? The person who cuts in line relies on everybody else following the practice while they violate the practice. So they're endorsing it for everybody else and making an exception of themselves. There's the contradiction in a double standard, right? So the person who cuts in line institutes a double standard. His intention both endorses for others and rejects for himself the practice of forming lines to determine the order in which people will be served. He makes an exception of himself, which is the essence of moral wrongness according to the universal law formula, and the essence of unfairness according to almost everyone. Right? Double standards are a pretty common understanding of fairness. If I said everybody with brown hair gets an A, and nobody else gets an A if you don't have brown hair, there's double standards in there, right? Unfairness is being instituted as a policy. So the first answer there, you needed some version of this. In order to get served faster, I will cut in line, or maybe in order to get served faster so I can see the movie with my friends, I'll get cut in line, but it's going to have to be something pretty close to that, right? The second version of it, universalized, is in order to cut in line, in order to get served faster, everyone cuts in line, right? So the idea of the practice of forming lines to get served is endorsed, and the practice of violating that practice is also endorsed, so we get a contradiction. So what does that mean about the morality of cutting in line? Impermissible, right, or prohibited. Again, contradictions generate moral wrongness for Kant. So it's again, rationality is what's driving that, right? Not personal sentiments or inclinations or desires. Yeah.
Can you go over another example where it would be permissible? Like, what was one of them?
Where what would be permissible?
Like a
Just an example of a permissible one?
Yeah, because they have obligatory and then impermissible, and those are like the two options.
They're two opposites, right? And Kant does a better job at pointing out what is wrong for us to do than identifying what we positively ought to do. Yeah, so there is that's another issue that comes up here. So if what Kant does is it's at least permissible if you can conceive it,
Okay,
right? If it's conceivable,
but no contradiction.
then it can't generate a contradiction of will. Otherwise, it would be always wrong to always do that. So you cannot do it sometimes and do it other times. Just imperfect duty, as opposed to the promise keeping, cutting in line, formals. You're never supposed to do those. Right. So that's why many people think of Kant's theory as an absolutist version of morality there, because he's got those perfect duties in there. So I mean, there are ones where, like, you got to tell the truth to the Nazi at the door and hope that the Nazi's going to come to his senses and start willing to perform the universalizability test about whether he should carry out his project of collecting people for extermination. Right. So that's a lot of maxims to worry about. Right. To be a conscientious Kantian, you got to be worried about, man, I got to figure out what my maxims are in lots of different scenarios. Right. And obviously, Baton Rouge drivers are violating this left and right when they're on the highway, and it's and there's traffic, right? So let's look at another version of the categorical imperative here. So that's the universal law version. Let's look at another version, and there's kind of two parts to this. First, Kant on moral personhood, and then the actual formula. I usually call it the humanity formula or the end in itself formula. It means some basic thing. So here's Kant on moral personhood. Non-rational have only a relative value as means. My pen is a non-rational being. My pen has value so long as it's able to do what? Right. So it's use value, right? Use value only. Remember, one of our big problems with contractarianism was accounting for the intrinsic value of individuals. Well, here's Kant trying to build a theory around that from the jump, right? So he says the non-rational have only a relative value as means and are therefore called things. Rational beings, on the contrary, are called persons because their very nature points them out as ends in themselves, that is, as something which must not be used merely as a means. It's a fancy way of saying don't use people. Right? So don't use them merely as a means. And so far, therefore, restricts freedom of action. It tells you what you can't do, like cut in line, right? And is an object of respect. These, therefore, are not merely subjective ends whose existence has worth only as an effect of our action, in other words, teleologically. Again, Kant's rejecting that as the basis for right and wrong. But objective ends, that is, as things whose existence is an end in itself, and moreover, for which no other can be substituted. If my pen runs out, I can get a new pen. But can't get a new India if India's gone, right? So it's because you're a rational being, not an animal, right? What's there? So an upshot of this is for Kant, we don't really have duties to like our pets. Might be a good thing that you're doing it, but you don't have actual moral obligations to them. In the next theory, you're going to have moral obligations to anything that can experience pleasure or pain, regardless of whether it's a rational being or not. So picking up on that idea of moral personhood, again, it's not about being a member of the Homo sapien species, but having a rational faculty, right? So loosely, we can just think of that in terms of critical reflection on thinking itself, right? And wondering, what am I doing and what am I not doing, and should I believe that, right? So here's the next version of the categorical imperative. For all rational beings come under the law that each of them must treat itself, so ourselves and others, never merely as a means, but in every case as an end, in every case at the same time as ends in themselves. So like for the utilitarians, again we'll cover next, but it's already been introduced in the reading, so I'll mention it here. I would have obligations to anything that experiences pleasure or pain. Right? But here it's got to be rational beings, right? So what do they mean by merely a means? There's a way in which I am using you and y'all are using me as means. How is that right now in our current context of a classroom setting in an educational institution?
Means to a degree.
I'm sorry?
Means to a degree.
Yeah. And then for me, I I get a paycheck. Not big enough one, but I get a paycheck, right? But that's not using us as mere means. You weren't rounded up against your will and forced to go to LSU, right? If somebody did that to you, your human rights have been violated, according to Kant. So what does he really mean here by a mere means? Because it's clear we're using each other in various ways on a loose notion of use, right? So here's Nora O'Neill that helps us with this. She says, to use someone as a mere means is to involve them in a scheme of action to which they could not, in principle, consent. So informed consent is going to play a big role in Kantian ethics. Each person assumes that the other has maxims of his or her own and is not just a thing or a prop to be manipulated. So what really makes us rational beings is that we can set ends for ourselves. That plays a big role here. So justice, remember fairness, requires us that we act on no maxims that use other as mere means or that generate formal contradictions. Beneficence, helping others, requires that we act on some maxims that foster others' ends, though it's a matter of judgment and discretion which of their ends we foster. Some maxims we ought not to be fostered because it would be wrong to do so. So we can get a different test out of Kant, this time the ends test, right? So first, formulate the maxim, apply the ends test. Does acting on the maxim involve violating the dignity of any rational beings? If you can get informed consent, then it's a different matter. But if I'm lying, I'm withholding information that's relevant, then I'm engaged in manipulation of others, treating them like a thing. Formulate the universalizability test. If the maxim can be universalized without contradiction, successful moral principles have got to survive both tests. So no contradictions, formal or contradictions of the will, and it can't use anybody as a mere means. Another rational being is a mere means. So suppose my job is to work for, let's do a self-service company. And I get a big bonus at the end of the month if I sign up enough people for contracts. And as a way of getting signatures, I go over to Tigerland at 12:30 on a Friday night and start asking people if they want to sign up for cell phone contracts. What are people generally like in Tigerland at 12:30? Put your phone away. Can I will to violate classroom policies? Interesting question. So they're usually, are they of rational minds? No. You can't give informed consent when you're inebriated, so I would be using them as mere means, right, for profit. For Kant, it's not the harm, the physical harm or the psychological harm of rape that makes it bad. It's that you use somebody against their mere means. It's not about pleasure or pain. It's about using them as a rational agent as a mere means. In utilitarianism, it's going to be about the harm, or the harms, really, but not for Kant. So on the universalizability test and the humanity formula, a character like Brian, who's a non-human rational agent, we still have obligations to them. Right? Make some sense? So we got two little tests out of Kant there. I will pause there and ask if there are any questions. Yeah.
So, well, I guess he just stops at human. Yeah, never mind.
Kant's theory is basically directed at adult, minimally rational beings.
Well, yeah, what does he mean about children?
So non-rational, also women.
Oh, God.
Oh, he's got some problems.
So he's from 1800s?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, he's got some pretty. So there are lots of interesting problems here to worry about. In early Kant, there's some stuff that looks basically racist in it, but by the end of it, people say he's out of that now. But so he's appealed to this idea of universality and beings, but children are non-rational, so you can treat them more like property. If they run away, you can go get them. Yeah. Stuff like that. So he's got that appeal. You can get human rights, universal human rights out of Kant really easy, but Kant himself looked like he was excluding some people from that category that we would want to include. So there's where you get to ask the question, is he following his own theory very well? Is he also a product of his own time and the bigotries of that stuff? Have all those sorts of things to worry about. Yeah, Savannah.
So when he says only using people as mirror means, he means like, you mentioned earlier that, we're using each other for means as teacher and student.
I'm sorry, say that again?
You mentioned earlier that we were using each other as means for like teacher and student. So like, just as mere means, right? So you can use somebody as means to an end, but as
You're not supposed to use someone as a mere means. You can, I got to go get an oil change later this week.
Right.
Right? There's no problem with that because that guy voluntarily opened up a business and I'm voluntarily going to it. So it's the mere means, right? So go back to this passage. To use someone as a mere means is to involve them in a scheme of action to which they could not in principle consent.
Okay.
Each person assumes, so respect for autonomy is a huge thing in Kant. It's up to each of us to perform the categorical imperative and do so rationally to figure out what's right or wrong. You can't be paternalistic. So you're going to get arguments for like classical liberalism out of Kant. You're going to have limited forms of government. There's a libertarian version of Kantianism for sure. There's one of those of utilitarianism as well. But here the idea is, is that internal logic of that maxim universalizable or not? If you get a contradiction, it's wrong. In the next theory, utilitarianism, if the outcomes are overall worse for everybody, then it's wrong. But for Kant, it's not about consequences at all.
I've heard that this universal law is the closest that a philosopher has gotten, just like someone's opinion. Is there contradictions or problems with it?
Oh yeah, well the generality of maxims, we've tried to solve that one a little bit, but some other problems. Do I have obligations to mentally disabled people if they're non-rational?
Okay. Well, because I guess then it's about defining the rationality part.
Yeah, stuff like that. Or if I'm more rational than y'all, doesn't that mean I'm worthy of more respect than you are? Okay. So we got some problems to pop up in there as well. We're going to have problems with each of these. But yeah, generality of maxims. The do-gooder objection to Kantianism. What if I'm doing my duty, but I do it begrudgingly, and I really hate being moral? That doesn't, for Kant's theory, that you would get full moral credit for that, but that looks like, it's better to both do the right thing and to want to do the right thing, right? So again, that's a difference between kind of how virtue ethics and character-based ethics, like Morris was talking about, are different than Kantianism. This is and the next theory is we're trying to come up with a decision procedure, right, basically. Trying to turn morality into an algorithm, basically, yeah. Other questions? Anybody else got anything? All right, next up is utilitarianism. They've already introduced that in the Joker article, right? There's a pretty easy answer for the utilitarians about killing the Joker. Joker's got to go on utilitarian grounds, right? Because it would save many more lives and reduce harm if we killed one in order to save many others, right? It's a trolley problem kind of thing there again. So in the next one, it's going to be about adding up and calculating units of pleasure and pain and how we can work that into a moral theory. All right, so you'll be reading about Watchmen for that one. All right, I'll see y'all on Thursday.